Emanuele, thanks for joining us. I know you've got a very busy schedule. Iran says its nuclear ambitions are for medical isotopes and for power production. Do we have a reason not to believe them?
They have pursued a nuclear program for 28 years now. They have invested billions of dollars trying to complete their effort, still haven't produced one single watt of electricity. So the claim that they're after civil nuclear power is at least suspect. In addition to that, the only nuclear power plant that they have built is the one in Bushehr on the coast of the Persian Gulf. And it's been built with Russian help and with the supply of fuel by Russia. So once again, why would they invest so much effort mastering the art of enrichment, given that they don't need to enrich fuel for the only nuclear power plant that they have? So if you take all of these things combined, it's highly suspicious that what they're saying is true.
Would Israel launch a preemptive strike?
Israel has launched 2 preemptive strikes in the past against nuclear facilities developed by enemies, Iraq in '81, Syria in 2007. In both instances, the operations were complex, challenging, even daunting, but infinitely less complex than a military attack on Iran would be. And these attacks occurred in the relatively early stages of the program, when neither reactors were operational. We are long past that stage when it comes to Iran, and I think that that tells you how reluctant the Israelis are to launch a strike. It's because of the complexities involved, the risks involved, but also the uncertainty of success. They would much rather see the threat of a nuclear Iran fended off by a joint international effort. That's why they have advocated a more robust effort by the international community, and that's why they are still willing to give time to sanctions and diplomacy. But as the former head of Israel's Mossad said, Israel would attack if the Iranian sword was on Israel's neck and cutting through its flesh. So if Israel feels really it's running out of time, with its back against the wall, no one else is acting, then the Israelis might do it.
The United States, though, it said it's got, President Obama said that they've got Israel's back. Would that include support after a strike?
There's plenty of reasons to believe that part of the President's statements must be understood within the context of an election campaign. At the same time, I would be very perplexed if a U.S. president, any U.S. president, when confronted with conclusive, compelling evidence that Iran is about to cross a threshold, would let them have it. This is a president who has repeatedly said his policy is prevention, not containment. The United States has stated in clear terms why a nuclear Iran is against its national interests. And in recent weeks, actually, if you look at what is happening in the Gulf, what you see is a very significant American military buildup, with more aircraft carriers in the theater, with minesweepers being sent to the region. That's clearly a strong signal to Iran not to test international community on its threats to close the Strait of Hormuz. So I actually think that if it came to that, and we had to confront the possibility of a military strike, it is more likely today that it would be carried out by the United States.
In which case, you mentioned Russia and its support for Iran. What would that mean in terms of international relations with the Soviet Union, or the old Soviet Union, with Russia?
Yeah, well, look, the Russians have been playing a very aggressive game in the region. There are reports in the media in the last few hours that they have sent special forces to Syria. They have been aggressively supporting the Syrian regime in its repression against its own people. They, they sit together with the Americans in the P5+1, the 5 permanent members plus Germany, mechanism for negotiations with Iran on the nuclear program. It may be the case that they do not wish to see a nuclear Iran in the end, but they also see a certain advantage in having a proxy in the Middle East that stands up to America and creates difficulties for America's influence and America's allies. So they certainly will not support the military attack. The question is, what will they do if it happens? And I don't think that they will go beyond diplomatic condemnations.
As far as internally in Iran, if there was some sort of concerted attack, would that mean that any opposition within Iran would tend to swing behind the regime? Would it increase support internally if there was an attack from outside?
Not all Iranians are Iranian nationalists. About half of the population is non-ethnic, non-Persian in ethnic terms, and the minorities inside Iran have been facing for a number of years ongoing on and off repression and hardship and restrictions from the regime. So there's no love lost between them and the regime. And the opposition, the Iranian opposition also has been long under the boot of oppression. So it's not entirely sure that if Iran was under attack, everybody all of a sudden would come out and rally around the regime. It is possible, but again, in the long term, the question should be, will and can an authoritarian regime actually survive the humiliation of a stinging military defeat? If you take other examples and precedents from elsewhere, take Argentina and the Falklands War or Serbia and the Kosovo campaign, neither Argentinians nor Serbian were enamored with or sympathetic to the forces that attacked their country in that war, and certainly the Falklands remain a nationalist issue in Argentina today, Kosovo in Serbia, but the tragedies and the suffering that those wars brought upon their own people by their dictators eventually led to the demise of those regimes. So I think that in the short term you might see a rallying around the regime, but in the long term, not so sure.
Let's take a brief break there, then we'll come back and we'll chat some more.
Thank you.
And welcome back to NZONE Focus. Our guest on the programme is Middle East expert Dr Emmanuele Ottolenghi. You've got countries like Saudi Arabia who are west-looking in many ways. How do they view Iran? Would they welcome a strike on Iran? Because they don't seem particularly close to Iran.
It's interesting. We have had a sort of a window open into the mindset of the rulers of the region when the WikiLeaks cable were leaked to the world. And what you see is that, at least at the leadership level, there is an enormous amount of apprehension about Iran's influence. You look at the history of the countries on the Arabian side of the Gulf, and what you see is that their current status as fairly independent countries is, if you wish, a historical aberration. I mean, they've always been ruled either by the Ottomans or by some Persian, imperial power structure. So they would like to keep it this way. They don't want to be in a situation where another regional power that is not Arab will dominate their own interests. Of course, their independence is largely based on the American umbrella, but America is, a foreign power. It doesn't belong to the region. It's beyond the horizon in many ways, and therefore it's a lot more acceptable. So, in that sense, I think seeing Iran cut down to size by a military attack that destroys this ultimate strategic threat would be welcome. On the other hand, of course, Iran will continue to be there even after a strike, and they are understandably apprehensive about the consequences and the responses that Iran would give to a military action. Of course, they have a significant American military presence that would defend them. They have their own military forces, which are quite well equipped and trained, but they have also very critical civilian infrastructure, starting from the oil industry, the refineries, the oil fields, the desalination plants, and you name it, the ports, and so on. And if Iran targeted those structures, it would be devastating for them. So if Iran can be deterred with sanctions and diplomacy, that would be much preferable.
Let's talk a bit about the Arab Spring, which has been going for more than a year now. Has that worked out the way that people thought it would? Certainly, what you seem to see happening in Egypt now is they're as unhappy now with a different regime in command as they were under Mubarak.
I think that Western responses to the Arab Spring were rather naive and premature. I mean, the very fact that we call it the Arab Spring suggests that we think it is a regional phenomenon that shares common points across the Arab world. And the word spring suggests, of course, that we're drawing a parallel with what happened in Central and Eastern Europe in 1989 when former communist bloc countries transitioned to democracy. I don't think that the parallel holds very well. There is certainly something shared in these events, in that people have taken inspiration from one country to another to go into the streets and challenge the ruling structure. Once they've seen it happen in Tunisia, the Egyptians took it to the streets, and once people saw it happen in Egypt, they said, well, if they do it, it means we can do it too, we can challenge the dictatorship. But I think that that's really the most common theme. Perhaps the demands also are somewhat similar, in that, broadly speaking, people have taken to the streets in protest to demand a different social contract, if you wish. They've gone to the street to demand more dignity, whether you understand it in terms of being left alone by the security services, being allowed to have a job, being allowed to provide for their families, and not have to live through the humiliation that led to the young man in Tunisia to set himself on fire and trigger this whole storm. But it's not necessarily a demand for a Western-style liberal democracy, which is based not just on free and fair elections, but also on human rights, civil rights, and so on. And again, the conditions for these countries to transition to democracy vary from place to place, but broadly speaking, you still have a very minimal, small-sized middle class, which is crucial to the establishment and consolidation of democracy. You have vast economic disparities. You have strong impediments to upward social mobility. You have an unequal distribution of resources. You have a situation whereby, paradoxically, when it came to religious and ethnic minorities, the authoritarian power structure allowed them a measure of protection that is now gone. And so, again, that would be one parameter to measure the success or failure of the Arab Spring in terms of transition to democracy. Are Christians safer in the Middle East today than they were under Mubarak, Saddam Hussein, and Ben Ali, or not? Are women more likely to achieve equal rights and have access to equal opportunities under these regimes that were toppled recently, or under their successors who claim to be democratic? And when you look at ethnic, religious minorities and women's rights, you realize that actually things are not necessarily better, and they're not going into a better place than we were before. So, with all due respect to people power, and recognizing the fact that these dictators were terrible for their own societies and deserved, in a way, to be toppled for all the horrors and the atrocities they inflicted upon their own people, I think that we're far away from the moment when we can call these countries democratic, and we should be a little more skeptical and realistic about the processes of transition they're going through.
Which brings us to Syria, which is ongoing violence, unpopular leader. I mean, it seems to have all the hallmarks that all the other Arab Spring countries had, but it's just rumbling on and on and on, and the death toll just increases every day.
And to which you have to add, tens of thousands of displaced, internally and externally displaced people, refugees, people arrested, people tortured, people who are casualties, although not killed, so wounded people. And it's actually striking that so far the international community has done very little to intervene and interfere. Syria is going to continue to be a river of blood because, you know, again, this tells you the difference between the various springs in the Arab world. Syria is a society that is multi-ethnic. And at the top of the power structure, there is a religious minority, a sect within Islam that the Sunni world consider to be heretic, which is quite eclectic within the Shia world. And they are at the top. They control the economy, the power structure, the security apparatuses, the military, the intelligence services. So the people who are in a position of power, when confronted with this kind of protest, and the military and intelligence services have every reason to cling on to power no matter what it takes, because they know that if they let go, they'll lose. And because they belong to different sects, there is less sympathy and empathy felt for those in the streets protesting. I mean, a lot of the protests really in these contexts, it was true in Libya, it was true in Bahrain, go along ethnic or religious fault lines. It wasn't the case in Tunisia and Egypt, which are much more homogeneous society, and so it was much harder for the security apparatuses to actually open fire on their own people. So I think that as long as the Assad regime has the financial means and the military equipment to continue the repression will be ongoing. And as long as their opposition does not have enough means to mount an effective military challenge to them, they will not gain the upper hand. Which brings us to the question of what should the international community do? And of course, there is a lot of reluctance on the part of Western leaders to intervene in any form and fashion beyond sanctions. And it's not that, though, if we don't intervene, nobody else does. The Russians are providing support to the Syrian regime. The Iranians are providing support to the Syrian regime. And there are reports that the Saudis and the Qataris are providing weapons to the opposition. So we're kind of sitting it out, and we will not have influence at the end of it as a result. And that's a shame, because if that's the case, the result will be either a consolidation of this regime only under much nastier forms, or an opposition that will be, you know, beholden to the Saudis. And I'm not sure that that's also something we would like to see as a result.
It's always fascinating to talk to you, Emanuele. Thank you very much indeed for your time.
Thank you. Thank you.